For the past 2 weeks, we've been looking at the life of Jacob, a man whose name means one who strives. He was called that because he came out of the womb with his hand grasping his brother Esau's ankle. Now, it was thought that he was seeking to be the firstborn because the firstborn received a greater portion of the inheritance. We've already seen how Jacob stole his father's blessing, which had been intended for his brother Esau, and is forced to flee Haran, the home of his uncle Laban. On the way to Haran, at a place called Bethel, Jacob has a dream of a ladder which rises into the heavens. At Bethel, Jacob makes a deal with God. If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. From Genesis 28, verse 20. It is not a perfect prayer. Indeed, it is quite a presumptuous and somewhat selfish prayer. But it is the kind of prayer you pray when you are still immature in your faith. But Bethel did something to Jacob. He was not the same headstrong young man he had been before. Now he is a man of principle and character. It's a good thing. At this point in his life, he has his principle and his character tested by his shrewd Uncle Laban. Last week we saw how Jacob fell in love with his beautiful cousin Rachel. He agreed to work for 7 years for her, and they seemed but a few days, according to Genesis 29, verse 20, because of the love he had for her. This is good stuff if you like romance stories. But Uncle Laban had different ideas. On the wedding night, he substituted Rachel's homelier older sister Leah to be Jacob's new wife. To show you how infatuated Jacob was with Rachel, however, he not only forgave his uncle, he agreed to work 7 more years to obtain Rachel. As we noted, it is one of the great love stories of all time. But finally, Jacob tires of jousting with his uncle Laban, and he starts longing to go back home. He has prospered in Haran, no matter how his uncle conspired to take advantage of him. Through Jacob's own cunning and God's providence, Jacob has come out ahead. But now his heart has turned toward home. He has some unfinished business there. He doesn't know it, but he also has some other unfinished business with God. We see that unfinished business with God come to fruition at a place which Jacob would later call Peniel. Jacob left Haran after some more conflict with his uncle Laban. Now he is preparing to meet his estranged brother Esau. That night Jacob camps by a brook, and all night long he wrestles with God. Have you ever spent the night wrestling with God? Perhaps Jacob was wrestling with regret about his past dealings with his brother Esau. It is not unusual for brothers to have conflict. A Sunday school teacher was teaching the importance of love in the home. She illustrated her point by referring to the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. And she asked if there was a commandment which taught how to treat sisters and brothers. One little boy from a large family raised his hand quickly. Innocently he asked, "Thou shalt not kill." Jacob's conflict with Esau was not that unusual. Still, Esau was his brother. Jacob was reaching the twilight years of his life now. He did not want to go to the grave with his precious relationship broken. It is not unusual for people to wrestle with regret over past misdeeds. Marcus Cato, the great Roman statesman who lived over 2,000 years ago, once said, "I can pardon everybody's mistakes but my own." Benjamin Franklin, toward the end of his life, said that he had such a good life that if he could do it again, he would run again from beginning to end, the same career of life. All he would ask would be the privilege of an author to correct in a second edition certain errors of the first. If there's any of us who would not make some corrections in the second edition, it's not unusual for a person to lie awake at night regretting the mistakes of the past. We would do well to heed the words of an unknown poet. Stand out in the sunlight of promise, forgetting whatever the past held of sorrow or wrong. We waste half our strength in a useless regretting, We sit by old tombs in the dark too long. Perhaps as Jacob wrestled with God, he was wrestling with the dark ghost of regret over those unfortunate misdeeds of yesterday. On the other hand, it could have been anxiety over future events that was keeping him awake. After all, he still had to confront Esau, and when he left home, Esau was in a righteous rage. According to Dr. John A. Schindler, 50% of all the people going to doctors in the United States are victims of just one disease. Of 500 consecutive admissions to the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, 77% were sick with this one malady. Dr. Schindler defines the disorder as psychoneurosis, and he identifies the cause as acute anxiety about the future. When Sir Walter Raleigh was burdened with a huge debt, his doctor said to him, "Sir Walter, if you don't stop worrying, you will die." Sir Walter looked up sadly and said, "I can't help worrying as long as that debt is over my head. It may kill me, but you might as well tell my cook to order the water in the kettle not to boil, as to command my brain not to worry." Perhaps it was acute anxiety with which Jacob was wrestling. His brother Esau was heading toward him with 400 men. He could not know Esau's intentions. It was reasonable that he should have some anxiety. Now, it is interesting how often guilt about the past is part of anxiety about the future. Besides, time was moving very quickly for Jacob, as it does for us all. He was no spring chicken anymore. What would happen to his family if he were incapacitated or even dead? Even if brother Esau didn't get to him, eventually Father Time would. There comes that time in a person's life when he starts asking such questions. What about his dimming eyesight and his faltering step? Boomers don't age very well, we are told. A man who has spent 2 decades trying to look like a teenager has a difficult task accepting the ravages of time. That is why mental health professionals expect an epidemic of suicides now that the baby boomers are entering middle and later years of life. What about the issue of death? Woody Allen once said that he was not afraid of dying. He just didn't want to be there when it happened. Jacob had a lot to think about as he lay there beside the brook. Perhaps it was anxiety about the future with which Jacob wrestled that fearful night. Or even more likely, perhaps it was the issue of Jacob's whole relationship with God that kept him awake that night. At Bethel, Jacob had prayed arrogantly, "If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God." However, Jacob prayed a different prayer as he prepared to bed down beside the brook with Esau headed toward him. He prayed this time, "O God, I am not worthy of the least of all thy mercies." Something profound had happened in Jacob's life, and it was more than fear of his brother. It had to do with the recognition of who God is and who we as human beings are. For Jacob, it culminated in this wrestling match beside the brook in a place he named Peniel. Jacob had always been a competitor, a striver, with men and with God. In the vernacular of TV commercials, he knew where he was going. He knew what he wanted. He was determined to do what he needed to do in order to get there. He would be in control. He would master the possibilities. The sky was the limit. Do you know anyone like that? They've always been with us, men and women determined to grab all the gusto that life has to offer them. And when they do, they discover themselves standing, holding a handful of foam, but nothing real or lasting. Jacob needed something more. He needed an overall purpose for his life. He needed to understand the overall scheme of things and where his life fit in. Suddenly he saw that his life was nearly over, and all that he had thought was important would soon be dust. What does it all mean? Who am I, really? Does my life really matter? As he wrestled with God that night, the encounter was so demanding that he threw the hollow of his thigh out of joint. One thinks of Jesus kneeling in the Garden of Gethsemane with drops of sweat like great drops of blood falling from his brow. This was that kind of encounter for Jacob. From this day forward, he would never be the same again. For you see, Jacob needed more than anything else in life to understand that God is the master of the universe and not Jacob. It is interesting that the being with whom Jacob wrestles does not prevail over him. As someone has said, Jacob is like a grand stallion. It is not God's desire that Jacob grovel at his feet. God has no use for one who is continually groveling. God wanted a grand stallion, but one who could be useful, one who could be saddled, one who would know his master is that he might fulfill his intended purpose. That is what God desires from us as well. Our lives are useful only to ourselves and only for a season if we refuse to give God the reins. The writer of Genesis closes this chapter in Jacob's life with a beautiful picture. It's a picture of a limping Jacob preparing to meet his brother Esau. He's no longer afraid of Esau. After all, he's wrestled all night with God. How can he fear a mere mortal? But now he's a new Jacob. He even has a new name, Israel. He will become a prince among men. Forevermore, his descendants, millions of them, will be known as the children of Israel. As the sun rises over Peniel, we see him standing there with a dislocated thigh, indicating his brokenness. Yet he is stronger than he has ever been before. His life is now aligned with the eternal purposes of God. How about you? Have you been wrestling with God? Isn't it time to let God be sovereign over your life? There's a story about a man who had misspent most of his life. A friend was teasing him about it. "St. John," he asked, mischievously, "you still spending a lot of time wrestling with the old devil?" The fellow answered good-naturedly, "Nowadays I spend most of my time wrestling with God." His friend asked incredulously, "Wrestling with God? How do you hope to win a wrestling match with God?" John smiled and answered, "Oh, you misunderstand. In this wrestling match, I'm hoping to lose." Amen.
Amen.